Hi everybody, welcome back to Civil War Monitors Behind the Lines. I'm your host, David Thompson. Today it's my privilege to be joined by Chris Wheeler, who is the producer, director, as well as writer of Civil War, The Untold Story, which is a 5-part miniseries that is going to be premiering with PBS this month nationwide. So Chris, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you, David, for having me. This is nice to be here.
This is going to be not your standard Civil War documentary, I think, for a lot of people who are Eastern Theater focused and centric. So why don't you give us just a little bit of background on what this miniseries is actually going to be about?
Well, I think it's going to be different on two levels, creatively and historically. Historically, it's going to be different because we're looking at the war through the lens of the Western theater. And if you're like me, most Americans grow up learning of the war through the East, through great battles of Gettysburg, Antietam, Bull Run, and you don't really hear too much about what happens on the other side of the Appalachians. Well, that's our focus. Our focus is the battles between the Appalachians and the Mississippi River, known historically as the Western Theater. So instead of looking at the war through battles like Gettysburg and the battles of the East, we examine Shiloh, Fort Donelson, Vicksburg, Chickamauga, Atlanta. The other part of it that's different, I think, is creatively. And what we do is, as Civil War buffs probably know, there's not a lot of documentation on battles of the West like there is of the East, namely photographs. So what we've done creatively is we have used reenactors, and we have reenacted these battles or recreated these battles in a very graphic and historically accurate way. It's an entertainment factor too, I think, that's really important because it's television. We need people to watch. You need to entertain them. If you entertain them, perhaps you could teach them something.
Now, you mentioned reenactments, and one of the most fascinating things as I was reading up about the series is the fact that you received access to film on and shoot on at least 3 different battlefields. And I wondered if you could explain kind of the process that went into, being able to get the permission, how that is even possible, and then what benefits for you as someone who is developing this story and wants to accurately portray the story does shooting actually on the battlefield do versus doing it, say, 50 miles away?
Well, that's a great question. The genesis of this project really begins with our work with the National Park Service. We produce National Park Service films in all the national parks. And this project actually began 5 years ago when we were awarded the contract to do the film for Shiloh National Military Park. That was followed by getting the contract to do the film for Chickamauga and Chattanooga. And following that, Kennesaw Mountain. So since we were producing these for the National Park Service, they gave us permission to film on the battlefields. And it is a privilege. It is probably a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, not just for us, but for the reenactors. You can imagine to be a reenactor and to be able to actually recreate these battles, these great battles, on the very grounds where blood was shed. So it was thrilling, I think, in a lot of ways for all of us to actually be on the very ground. And I think it shows, it was exciting for us behind the cameras, but I think it was even, it was really exciting for the reenactors themselves because it's a once-in-a-life opportunity. And I think the fact that we were actually filming these on the historic grounds, I think it shows in the performances of the reenactors. There were times, and I guess I think back of a cold, rainy day on Shiloh, and we were actually filming one day on the 149th anniversary of that battle, in the very ground where the battle was happening. And the weather was chilly, it was very moody and evocative, and when the camera started rolling and the special effects started flying and you had people made up, I mean, there were glimpses where it almost felt like you were transported back in time.
Now, you're also, in addition to using reenactors, some of the things that people may be more familiar with, particularly with the recent documentaries, I say recent for Ken Burns, but we're now 20 years beyond that. But in terms of archival sources, as well as historians, authoritative figures that you bring into the fold as well. So I wondered if you might be able to speak just a little bit to those dimensions for this production.
Well, we tap into archival images. There's a great record of images. They tell the story in a way that, I think when you just have battle recreations, there's an element, well, it's just a feature, it's just an interpretation. Then you see the photographs of the portraits of, Confederate soldiers, Union soldiers, and African American soldiers. It really brings home the reality of what happened. So the archival is an important element. However, our film really is driven by the battle recreations. I think that's what separates our film from Ken Burns. Ken Burns' series of obviously was it's marvelous. It's a work of art and it's historic in itself. But what we do that's different than Ken is we choose to visualize this through recreations, and part of it is out of necessity. It goes back to there's no photographs of what happened at Shiloh or Chickamauga or Vicksburg. There's a few photographs. Somebody actually got a camera and took some great photos of Atlanta, but not of the battles. So how do you tell these stories if you're a producer, television producer? It's television. Visuals drive everything. If you don't have the visuals, how can you tell the story? So we chose to create the visuals through these battle recreations. And I think therein was a wonderful opportunity to really tell these stories in the way that they deserve to be told. We weren't limited in any ways by lack of visuals. When it comes to the Western theater, I think Ken felt probably that I imagine he had the challenge of how do I, as a producer, tell the story of the West when there's very little visuals. So it all kind of circles back to why it's one of the reasons I think why the Western theater doesn't get as much attention on the East. It's simple. There's not the source material to help tell that story. And in the medium of television, so reliant upon images, what are you going to use? So that's, I think, what's different about our series. And I think it's traditional in other ways. It's non-traditional in our visual approach. I think it's, in our visual approach, I think it's much more, it looks more like a feature film. But it sounds like a traditional documentary. We have a narrator. Her name it's Elizabeth McGovern. Those who are fans of Downton Abbey will recognize her, and she does a wonderful job. But at the heart of what we're doing are the analysis of the historians, and we got some brilliant historians to provide insightful commentary that take our understanding of this theater and of the war itself, I think, to a new level. And we purposely sought out kind of the next generation, I think, of historians. Nothing against the old guard who are fantastic and great interpreters of this battle, but I think we were looking for new voices and new faces to help give this documentary film a fresh look. And I'm in awe of the people that we interviewed for this film. They are, in a word, brilliant, and I loved spending time with each and every one of them.
Now, I wondered, for your perspective, and then perhaps this dates back to your work with the MPS projects with Shiloh and Chickamauga and Chattanooga, did you, coming into this, think, I'm almost going to be looking at somewhat what people believe to be an afterthought? A lot of historians have started to say we really need to focus on the West. That is where the war was won and where it could have been lost for the Union. Have you found that by doing your research and putting this together, it has kind of reaffirmed what you already believed? You thought that the Western theater was shafted to begin with, or is this something that through your research you've really discovered that it really is a powerful story?
I'm convinced it's where the war was won and lost, and I think many of the historians we interview believe so too. For me, this was a kind of a journey of discovery. I began this project not maybe knowing a little bit more about the Civil War than the average American, but not much. And so I kind of, learned the story in increments. First, I learned about Shiloh. And then I learned about Chickamauga. By the time I started learning about what happened in Kennesaw Mountain in Atlanta, then I started to put the pieces of the puzzle together and connecting the dots that these were these three parks or these three battlefields were not independent stories. They were actually part of one larger story. So that got me really interested in not just these individual stories, but the entire theater themselves, which I felt, which I find is fascinating. And, and then once I got a better understanding of the Western theater, I think the next step was to really understand the Western theater's place in the entire war. And when you put it into context of the entire war, I think it's hard not to really believe that this is where the war was won and lost. Not to speak flippantly about the great battles of the East, where so many men were killed, and those were, of course, hugely significant. But I think in our studies of the Civil War, that's been for many, that's just been the sole focal point. We think of the Civil War, we think of those battles, and there's a much larger way to look at this. So I think the West, in a word, when you really study the West, the best word I can use to think of it is decisive. And every battle is decisive. Great distances are covered. Cities are fought over and lost, cities like Vicksburg and Atlanta. And I think the most fascinating thing of all about the Western theater is how at the very end of the war, the West comes east. After Sherman's march to the sea, he marches through the Carolinas. He's going directly to Petersburg, where Grant and Lee are engaged in a siege. And Lee knows that to the south is Sherman with 100,000 soldiers coming at him. And I think that has profound influence on Lee's next move, which was to escape Petersburg and head the only direction he could. He couldn't go south because he knew that Sherman's coming. So he heads west, and the rest is history.
I wonder if you could speak for a minute, just from your perspective of producing this and putting this on, of what were some of the greatest challenges that you faced, really as a director, as a writer, and as a producer of this, that you could probably share with some of our viewers, something that they may not necessarily think of when they see this as a final product on their television screens?
Well, I mean, that's a great question. It was so challenging on so many levels that there's many times where I've been overwhelmed. I think just looking at the history itself and trying to understand this complex, nuanced history and I'm still trying to understand it. That was difficult, and it continues to be difficult. I think it goes back to, I've really had the benefit of working with people who are so knowledgeable about the Civil War, and I'll start with the folks at the national battlefields themselves: Stacey Allen at Shiloh, Jim Ogden at Chickamauga, and Anthony Weiniger and Willie Johnson at Kennesaw, and also Terry Vicksburg. So all of those folks just, I guess I was just very fortunate to learn this battle from people who have dedicated their lives to, or learn the history from people who are dedicated their lives to studying those individual battles. So that's one thing. I guess on the production side, there's a whole different overwhelming aspect of these. It's recreating these battles, and that's number one, finding how do you find the right reenactor. We put a lot of time and emphasis into finding people who are 20 to 30-year-old reenactors. Now, there's not very many of those. Most of the reenactor community right now is older in age, and the average soldier, as you know, was between 20 and 30 years old. So we wanted authenticity in that. We also wanted young guys that we could, quite frankly, work really hard. I mean, we wanted to graphically recreate these battles, and there's a very physical component to that. So just finding the folks to help us recreate these battles that come to set with the proper uniforms, proper guns, all of the props, making sure that everything is historically accurate, that is a huge challenge. And then it's just the reenactments themselves. It's, you have at one point at Shiloh, we had 350 reenactors. Well, we just can't have those guys show up. We have to care for them. So we had to provide catering for them. We had to provide parking. We had to provide corrals for their horses. We had to provide porta potties for all of these men. And so just imagine all of the work that it took just to get to the point where we're saying action. And in many ways, once we started rolling cameras, there was a sense of relief that we're finally to the point where we can actually film and do, I think, what we're comfortable doing. So it was, I always say, in very many ways, the filming part of this series was the easy part.
Now, finally, Chris, I'll let you go on this question. The Untold Story, it's not just that the Western theater, is very important and perhaps decisive in this conflict, but it's the story of former slaves becoming Union soldiers, things of that nature. So I wonder if you could speak to perhaps the other dimension here of the untold story that you're trying to get across with this series.
Yeah, thank you. I think the Untold Story initially became the Western theater, and it still is in very many ways. But as we got deeper into the subject matter, other themes arose that I think became really a part of the Untold Story. One that is the experiences of Southern civilians. I'm from Ohio. I grew up in Ohio, and I think my Civil War experience and people from the North has been shaped differently than those in the South. People in the South, their ancestors had to deal with this war in ways that people in the North, with the exception of Gettysburg and perhaps Chambersburg, never had to experience. The war was real. The war wasn't far away. The war was literally sometimes on their front doorstep. And the war was fought in their homes. So that shapes, I think, that war experience and how different it was between North and South shaped particularly the civilian experience. So we focus on civilian stories, Southern civilian stories, at places like Vicksburg and Atlanta, cities where civilians were literally in the crossfire. And their experiences, I think, the Southern civilian experience really does, I think, in very many ways, shape how they look at the war today. And how they look at the war today is dramatically different than perhaps how people in the North think so. And I think it comes down to one fundamental fact: the war was fought in their home. So there's that part of the untold story. And the other really important component that we call the untold story is the experiences of the African Americans, from enslavement to being contrabands to emancipation to volunteering and fighting for their freedom. And I think that's a part of the story that I feel is undertold when we're telling stories of the story of the American Civil War. And sometimes it's not even told at all. But I think that it's critically important. It's a primary storyline for us. Every one of our 5 hours addresses this story in some significant way. And I think it's a story that we need to hear today, that we don't hear enough. And, once the Civil War such a tragic story, horrific story, but there is a shining light in this story, and it's the story of the African Americans and their quest for freedom and their willingness to put their lives on the line to defend it. I really consider it the shining light of the American Civil War. And I really feel, when you think about it, what can be more American than the actions of African Americans during that time? They sought freedom. They chose to fight and to die for it. And that's fundamentally, I think, what we consider and what we take pride in as Americans. So it's a really important story. It's been not told as well or as strongly as I think it should be, but we're trying to. I think it's a very important point that we're trying to get across to our viewers here, that this is not a secondary story. This is a primary story.
Well, Chris, fair enough. I want to thank you so much for taking some time out of your day, taking some time out of your tour, going around the country and sharing the story as it is about to premiere. Again, it's Civil War, The Untold Story, premiering this month on PBS. Please check your local listings. I've had a chance to get a little bit of a sneak peek, along with some others, I am sure, and I can say to the viewers here that you will not be disappointed. It is a powerful, powerful narrative, and it is beautifully done and produced, and that's all really a testament to you, Chris, and the hard folks that work with you. So thanks again for coming on, and hopefully we can have you back on again in the future talking about another Civil War project.
Well, thanks so much for having me. Really appreciate it.